Hey there, coffee lovers. As a PCOS dietitian, I get asked all the time, can I have my morning cup of joe if I have PCOS? And the answer is yes, but it also depends. Did you know that women with PCOS are 2 to 3 times more likely to be sensitive to caffeine? It's true, and you might be wondering why. So grab your favorite beverage and let's dive into, can women with PCOS still drink caffeine safely? By the way, if you're new here, hello and welcome. My name is Katie. I'm a registered dietitian and certified personal trainer specializing in PCOS. And I'm here to help you balance your hormones and look and feel your best using a non-diet approach. So make sure to stick around until the end of this video, because not only will we be talking about how much caffeine is recommended for PCOS, but also how you can use different food pairings to optimize blood sugar when you do consume caffeine. And if you enjoy this video, make sure to consider subscribing and hitting the like button on this video. I always appreciate it. Have you ever wondered why caffeine is often not recommended for those with PCOS? Well, here's the lowdown. 70 to 80% of women with PCOS experience insulin resistance at some point in time. It's a key characteristic of PCOS where the body becomes less responsive to insulin and the impact of insulin on blood sugar, therefore potentially raising blood sugar and causing other types of imbalances that can lead to having a difficult time losing weight and also experiencing cravings, brain fog, fatigue, and even symptoms like acne. Caffeine stimulates the release of cortisol and adrenaline, which can temporarily cause a spike in blood sugar. But if you thought the effects of caffeine on blood sugar stopped there, hold tight. While temporarily caffeine can cause a spike in blood sugar, it can also cause a subsequent dip in blood sugar, meaning the potential for hypoglycemia and even like a more mild, moderate version of what you think of as hypoglycemia. So you might notice things like brain fog, fatigue, feeling really hangry, or feeling lightheaded or dizzy. When we consume caffeine and have that initial spike in blood sugar, it causes a bodily response of secreting more insulin, which is something that opens the door to our cells and allows blood glucose to go into the cells for use. So you're stimulating more blood sugar, more insulin, and thus having that quick response of spike in blood sugar and sudden drop. Again, this is why we often see carb cravings and this never-ending cycle of feeling high energy from caffeine and then feeling that inevitable drop where we crave all the carbs in the world and we feel like nothing can solve our problems except more caffeine and more carbohydrates. So all of this to say, while that initial cup of joe can be really beneficial for our energy in the short term, it's also important to be mindful of how caffeine impacts our body, our brain, and our blood sugar in the long term. But before you click off of this video in tears because you think you can never enjoy caffeine ever again, here's the thing. I still believe as a PCOS dietitian that there are safe ways to consume caffeine in moderation without messing up your hormones long term. With PCOS, there are so many things that we're told to avoid and cut out of our diet. But my philosophy as a dietitian is that you should be as liberal as possible with your diet until proven otherwise. In other words, for something like caffeine, you should consume it in moderation unless your body is telling you otherwise, and then you can find that happy medium or that amount that feels good to you. More on that later, but for now, let's talk about the upper limit of caffeine for PCOS. All right, so we can't talk about the upper limit for PCOS without talking about what the typical upper limit is. So the standard upper limit for caffeine for individuals who don't have any underlying health conditions is about 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. That's about 4 cups of coffee, 6 cups of black tea, or 14 cups of green tea. However, when it comes to PCOS, I strongly believe that the upper limit should be reduced just by a little bit, again, because of how caffeine impacts our cortisol, which can impact our insulin, thus impacting our PCOS symptoms. So I would approximate the PCOS upper limit of caffeine to be about 200 to 300 milligrams, which would be about 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day or 3 to 4 cups of black tea. Keep in mind that tea has varying levels of caffeine, from herbal, which has none, to black coffee, which has a pretty high amount, about 1/3 the amount of caffeine from coffee. So just remember that all tea is not created equal. But the question is the upper limit the recommended amount of caffeine? On average, probably not. Chances are for most women with PCOS, it's less. And again, we're speaking to this in terms of optimizing blood sugar and feeling our best and reducing cortisol. On a typical, standard, average day, I would probably recommend somewhere in the middle of 50% of that upper limit to 75%. So that could look like a cup of coffee and a cup of black tea in the evening, or 3 cups of green tea, or potentially 2 cups of half-calf coffee. And I also think it's important to note that not all coffee is necessarily created equal either. For example, if you go to Starbucks, their lattes are going to be a lot more high in caffeine than your standard cup of joe because they're using espresso shots in the latte. So it's good to be knowledgeable and to check online or on the labels to see how much caffeine you're actually getting from the cup of coffee that you consume. If you're still feeling stuck on what exactly your personal number is, again, remember it is so individual. So one of you may have 200 or 300 milligrams as your upper limit for caffeine, and that means you have Starbucks and a cup of coffee per day and you're just fine. Whereas someone else might be pretty sensitive to caffeine and 1 cup of half-calf is all you can tolerate. I highly recommend keeping a journal of your caffeine intake for at least 1 or 2 weeks and log the response that your body has to that caffeine. Track your symptoms, your anxiety, how you're feeling, how jittery you are, how anxious you are, how was your sleep that night, and also, did you have any acne that week? Sometimes that release of cortisol can actually increase testosterone in the body and thus increase acne. So it is important to monitor any and all symptoms, not just your standard energy and anxiety, which are important as well, but there's so many symptoms that coffee can impact. Then at the end of that 1 to 2 weeks, don't just throw away that journal. Make sure you check it out and look for patterns. Look for the amount of caffeine that you felt the best with, or if you were on average having 2 to 3 cups of coffee and you notice that didn't feel good to me at all, try to aim for 1 to 2, or maybe having 2 cups but half-calf. Test it out and see what works for your body because you know your body best. Question of the day: how many cups of coffee and or tea do you drink per day? And bonus points if you can answer, do you notice a difference between the different types of caffeine sources and how you feel? For example, caffeine is in coffee, it's in tea, it's also in chocolate. Do you notice a big difference between the sources of caffeine that you get? Or does it all kind of feel the same? Let us know in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you. And if this topic interests you, then consider signing up for my waitlist for the Nourishing PCOS program. I'm currently really excited to be creating a program all about PCOS management and blood sugar management. It includes everything from a private Facebook community group, meal plans, guided modules to help you manage PCOS using a non-diet approach, and even guided meditations for things like body image and cravings and all the things like that. So I'm super excited. I don't have a date set for it yet. I am currently 29 weeks pregnant, so we will see when the official launch date is, but I'm hoping that it'll be as soon as possible, and I will tell you more when I know more. And if you're watching this video, another question you might be asking yourself is, if I continue my coffee routine and to have coffee as a normal part of my lifestyle, is there a better way to consume caffeine and coffee that will impact my blood sugar less? And the good news is the answer is yes. And there are 3 main ways that you can do this. Number 1, never have coffee on an empty stomach. It is so important for most people to get a balance of food with their caffeine, but especially if you have PCOS, this can really throw your hormones out of whack and it can cause a lot of unnecessary stress anxiety, and potentially low blood sugar. Number 2 also has to do with food, and that is adding protein and fat to your meal with caffeine. So the very first thing that you should do is have food in general, but if you want a gold star, A+ on this assignment from your dietitian, then adding protein and fat is gonna help slow down that blood sugar spike and dip even more so. And we haven't talked about this in a full video yet, but I do have an Instagram reel that I recently put out about dairy and the impacts of it on acne. And in that video, we talked about how consuming higher fat dairy for PCOS can actually be better for insulin resistance because the glycemic index of higher fat dairy is lesser so. So what you really want to avoid with caffeine is having those really sugary caffeinated beverages, because then not only are you getting the spike in blood sugar from the caffeine, but you're also getting it from the large amounts of sugar that can often be pumped into caffeine. So I highly recommend going the lower sugar route. If you can just get less pumps, that would be wonderful. You can also do sugar-free if you prefer it that way, and adding higher fat milk. I know it seems completely counterintuitive to most of the things that we've been taught in the past about high fat being a bad thing, but in this case, it can actually be better for blood sugar in the long term. And the third tip is to spread out your caffeine throughout the day. So this may seem like a given and something that's totally obvious, but a lot of times with caffeine, it's easy to overdo it in a single chunk in our day. So for example, instead of having that venti Starbucks latte first thing in the morning where you're kind of piling up all your caffeine and then slowly, hopefully waiting the whole rest of the day for that caffeine to eventually wane off and, not give you crazy energy by the end of your evening, we want to spread that out. So in an ideal world, instead of a giant venti latte first thing in the morning when your cortisol is actually naturally higher anyway, you want to have multiple small little increments of caffeine. So what you could potentially do if you're going through that Starbucks drive-thru is start with a tall drink instead of a grande or a venti. I'm pretty sure they have the same amount of caffeine in a grande as a venti, so it's very misleading, but they actually, I believe, have 2 shots in both, just more milk in the venti. So definitely something to look out for. Another thing that you can do if you're going through the Starbucks drive-thru is to get half calf instead of, whole calf or whatever you would call it. They'll essentially make one of the shots of espresso decaf and then the other one full calf. So you get exactly how it sounds, half calf. You could also do decaf if you prefer that as well. And another thing in terms of spreading it out and timing is having regular coffee versus something like Starbucks. So if you didn't already know, Starbucks is a lot more potent in caffeine than your regular cup of joe because it's made with those espresso shots versus just regular, drip coffee. You can get drip coffee at Starbucks, but it's typically not what the standard person gets in an order. So for the amount of caffeine that's in one Starbucks latte that's a grande, you could have 2 regular cups of coffee at home spread out through, throughout the day instead of just in one chunk of time. Remember, our response to caffeine is all individual, so pay attention to your body and what it's telling you, and then adjust your caffeine accordingly. It doesn't have to look exactly the same as your neighbor, as your partner, or even as someone else who is diagnosed with PCOS as well. It can be different, and you can still be managing your PCOS properly. If the topic of PCOS interests you, then I highly recommend checking out the description below, where I'll leave links to all my resources and how you can work with me, including my Nourishing PCOS course, which is coming soon. The waitlist is open, so if you want to sign up for that, you will be the first to know when it launches, and you'll also get a really super special discount for signing up for the waitlist. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your experiences with caffeine, coffee, and PCOS in the comment section below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.